going to make any kind of claim about your product, you have to be able to substantiate it. And the best substantiation is not going to be just relying on marketing materials that your ingredient supplier might have provided. The best way to substantiate your claims about a particular product is to test the product. And you can do this either through a clinical setting or you can do it through the consumer perception.
Hello, and welcome to FDA Watch. I'm Wayne Pines. As you know, we're the only independent national forum dedicated to discussing the latest developments and issues surrounding FDA. I always start out by reminding you, if you haven't formally subscribed to our podcast, you can do so. Go to fdawatch.net. You just enter your email address and you click on subscribe. It's free. When you subscribe, you'll get emails telling you when a new episode appears, as well as easy access to our headlines and resource links, as well as some additional background about our guests. In this episode, we're going to focus on cosmetics and personal care products. We have two outstanding guests. You'll meet them in just a moment, but first let me get to some headlines. There have been a few stories, including a major one in the Wall Street Journal, that describes tension between Commissioner Marty Makary and HHS Secretary Kennedy over Makary's management of FDA. Of course, both sides say that it's not so, and we'll just have to see how this evolves. We have no reason to think that Dr. Makary is in any jeopardy, but we'll just have to watch and see what's going on in terms of that relationship. From the Pharma desk, more about the personnel at FDA. An article in The Guardian says that the scramble to find a replacement for former CDER Director George Tidmarsh left FDA in, I'll use quotes here, in a state of turmoil and tensions. Tidmarsh, of course, has been replaced by Rick Pazner, been with FDA for 26 years as head of oncology. Now he has a wider challenge, a wider portfolio. It was widely reported that he originally turned down the offer. There has been a lot of controversy at that level of the agency. Of course, back in July, CDER Director Vinay Prasad was let go, only to be brought back just a few days later. Now we'll see how comfortable Rick Pazner is in his new expanded role. And of course, this is a drama that continues to unfold. From the device desk, according to the Economic Times, European medical device manufacturers are feeling the squeeze of U.S. tariffs. The CFO of Siemens Healthineers said that although the company sees good prospects in the U.S. market, it's tightly managing its costs and may think about potential value-add shifts to counter the duties. The company expects doubled tariff impacts by 2026. Other companies have said they're also facing margin pressures and tariff hits. The effect of tariffs on device imports is certainly something we'll continue to monitor as we head into the new year. On the food side, HHS Secretary Kennedy called for greater research into food allergies at a meeting earlier this month. He criticized NIH for a lack of human studies on food allergies. He said, and this is a quote, "We need to make sure that we're getting gold standard science and that the science is not responsive to prejudice or to bias or to official orthodoxy, that people are allowed to ask questions and they're allowed to question everything and nothing is off bounds." According to the Food Allergy Fund, allergies affect 1 in 13 children and 1 in 10 adults in the U.S. We'll see whether Kennedy's statements lead to any additional resources for research into food allergies. Now let's meet our guests. First up is Rachel Raphael. She's a partner at Morgan Lewis. She's a litigator, risk management counselor. She represents clients across a variety of industries, including consumer products, personal care, and cosmetics. Just as a sidelight, Rachel has an active pro bono practice. She represents asylum applicants and individuals seeking citizenship. She also has defended clients in criminal proceedings and represented federal inmates before the U.S. Parole Commission. She's also on the advisory committee of the Global Retailer and Manufacturer Alliance. Before joining Morgan Lewis, she was a partner at another international law firm. Welcome to FDA Watch.
Thank you very much, Wayne.
Also joining us today is Ronie Schmelz. She's a partner at K&L Gates in the firm's commercial disputes practice. She spends half her time representing clients in litigation, particularly consumer class actions, and also counsels clients on litigation avoidance strategies. She deals with contract and intellectual property matters, privacy, automatic renewal and loyalty programs, implementation of recall procedures, Prop 65, responding to FDA warning letters. She's vice chair of the Independent Beauty Association. She chairs the organization's Government and Public Relations Committee and also serves on the board and legal advisor to Beauty Industry West. Welcome to FDA Watch, Ronie.
Thank you so much, Wayne.
Let's start at a high level. Start out with Rachel. What's your take on what's happening currently at FDA when it comes to cosmetics and personal care products, or what's not happening at FDA? Again, Rachel, let me start with you and then turn to Ronie.
Sure. So, until very recently, there really wasn't much to report regarding FDA and particularly the Modernization of Cosmetics Regulation Act, or MOCRA. And frankly, that's not terribly surprising given the current presidential administration. But just recently, there are two developments, I think, worth noting from the last week or so. The first development involves the recently approved Senate bill to end the federal government shutdown, which included an FDA appropriations bill requiring, among other things, a report in 90 days from FDA on the timeline for issuing MOCRA cosmetic good manufacturing practices, or GMPs, and also included $2 million for MOCRA's implementation. Of course, it's still really unclear at this point what this means as a practical matter. And I think in particular, given the considerable FDA staffing cuts that limit the attention the agency can practically give to cosmetics and personal care products, but worth noting nonetheless. The second development is FDA's launch of a real-time adverse event reporting dashboard for cosmetics. So we've seen with real-time reporting in other contexts, this means no real FDA verification and no ability for companies to correct misinformation in real time. And all of this creates the very real possibility that damaging and unsubstantiated information about cosmetic companies and their products could be, released into the public realm with no real recourse. And I will say, even before these developments, we were still stressing the importance of MOCRA to cosmetics and personal care companies, not necessarily out of concern about FDA enforcement per se, but because other industry actors, state regulators, and the plaintiffs bar, for example, are still paying careful attention and looking to exploit weak spots in company missteps. And now with this real-time, BEARS database, provides even more of a launch pad to do just that.
Let me turn to Ronie in a second, but Rachel, let me just ask you one follow-up question. In this environment, what are you advising clients to do in terms of responding to what's going on at FDA?
So, it still is all very new and fresh. I think, a lot of what we've been advising to date still stands, right? Because as I mentioned, we've been advising companies to keep MOCRA compliance front of mind, even when there really wasn't much to report on coming out of FDA. I think this makes it all the more important now, given these recent developments. And I think, certainly this brings to a head, and I'm sure I'll mention this more than once over the episode in terms of priorities for companies, is this need to monitor products once they hit the market, have systems in place to track customer complaints and investigate complaints where they need to, allows the company to be as nimble as possible and to react quickly, which is, again, important, especially if, given this most recent development, this real-time adverse reporting database that I mentioned kind of brings potential misinformation to light in real time.
Yeah, Ronie, let me ask you the same questions in terms of what's your views on what's going on at FDA and how companies should react.
Sure. Thanks, Wayne. Well, as far as the implementation of MOCRA and the like, as we've seen historically since it was passed, FDA has received from Congress certain time frames and timelines in which they're supposed to take action, and they've pretty much blown through almost all of them. And in the reauthorization bill, the Appropriations Act that Rachel mentioned, there is a timeline for the 90-day report on allergens and the like and GMPs. It remains to be seen whether they're going to blow through those timelines as well, but hopefully not, because we are, as an industry, looking for, the rules on talcs, the bans on formaldehyde, and in particular the fragrance allergens. So hopefully those will be forthcoming. In terms of counseling clients regarding MOCRA, I mean, obviously they should have already made sure their products are listed, that their manufacturers are registered, and the like. But most of the focus that we've had is on satisfying the requirements and making sure that they have SOPs or standard operating procedures in place for reporting serious adverse events, because there is a time limit and sensitivity to making sure that you are reporting, if required, those serious adverse events. And we're also talking a lot about safety substantiation, which is now required, which frankly, everybody should have had anyhow. But under MOCRA now, we are required to make sure that we have adequate safety substantiation. And with that comes the ability for FDA, if there is an issue, to inspect and to come in and review any adverse events or serious adverse events. And so we're counseling clients on putting procedures in place that track substantiation and have the information in their product dossiers, but also putting procedures in place so that if they have a visit from the FDA, they're very clear in terms of what they are required to share, what they don't need to share, having the point person in place, the responsible person for interacting with the FDA. So those are the sorts of things that we're doing in the background, making sure that people and companies are in compliance and hoping that they never have to visit with the FDA for purposes of MOCRA or otherwise.
Let me ask you this. You're both members of industry organizations and very active in the field. What are companies talking about with regard to FDA these days? Let me start, Rachel, with you. What are they saying? What's their point of view? And then turn to Ronie for the same question.
I think certainly at the start of the year with this new presidential administration, there were a lot of questions as to what this would mean in terms of FDA enforcement and how worried did they really need to be about MOCRA. And so, that those were the big question marks. I think there was a little bit of a sense of, okay, maybe we can breathe a sigh of relief here, because this administration is unlikely to make cosmetics in particular, and frankly, federal regulatory enforcement more generally a priority, which is pretty standard under Republican presidential administrations. But I think, echoing what Ronie said, and also echoing back to what I had said earlier, still our job is to remind clients that really there isn't a sigh of relief. At least MOCRA compliance is just as important, whether or not the concern is that FDA is vigorously enforcing it or not.
Ronie, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, most of the conversations that we are having regarding the FDA are pretty much, that MOCRA is in there in the background, but this is also an administration that has basically instructed its different departments to try to start withdrawing regulations. And so we don't expect a lot more other than MOCRA implementation to be the subject of FDA enforcement. Honestly, most of our conversations nowadays are state focused. That's where all the activity is, given the hibernation of Congress and of the agencies.
Yeah, let me ask you to elaborate on that with regard to what's going on in the states.
Sure. I guess nature abhors a vacuum. And so, in the absence of the federal government taking the lead on a lot of different things, for example, chemical bans, which was expressly excluded from MOCRA, we see the states coming in and stepping into the void. And the states have been incredibly active, not only on chemical bans, which we've seen in a number of states. We are now seeing a lot of legislation regarding packaging and environmental concerns in terms of recyclability. And so, in the absence of the federal government coming in, 50 states are now considering what they're going to be doing. And that creates a very challenging environment for our companies that we are dealing with. We're basically playing whack-a-mole, seeing which state is coming up with which regulation. Unfortunately, there is very little coordination among the states. And as a result of that, it doesn't necessarily mean that if you abide by one state law, that you're going to be in compliance for other states. Instead, you're going to have to now monitor each of the states in order to determine what their requirements are. And as we counsel clients, find the strictest state, which happens in most instances to be California, where I practice. And typically it's been, if you satisfy, California with privacy or Prop 65 and all these other things, that you should be, okay across the country. And unfortunately, that's no longer the case. And so it's really critically important. Yes, of course, you need to monitor what's going on at the federal level with FDA, frankly, with FTC, the Federal Trade Commission as well. But really, the focus also needs to be on what's happening at the state level.
Rachel, anything to add?
Sure. Yeah, I just would just echo what Ronie said, that it's really critical given this kind of patchwork of state requirements, particularly with the chemical bans and restrictions and what seems kind of like a constantly evolving list of off limits ingredients that create real vulnerabilities. It's really important that companies stay on top of what's going on in the states across the country with that eye, of course, to the subset of states that are kind of leading the charge here in the U.S. I know Ronie mentioned California. That's obviously just the tip of the iceberg, but it is, or tip of the spear, probably, so to speak. I think companies also need to stay up to speed on what's going on internationally, particularly in the EU, which is really at the forefront when it comes to, regulating the safety of cosmetics and personal care products. And the U.S. by and large, lags a little bit behind. And I think, in addition to possible action by state regulators themselves, this patchwork of state requirements creates a real litigation risk um, in terms of the plaintiff's bar, which again is kind of carefully dissecting ingredient labels in light of the kind of disparate restrictions and bans, I think both here and abroad. So we've even seen litigation over ingredients that may be subject to scrutiny in the EU for possible adverse health risks, even though, use of those ingredients are really perfectly permissible here in the US. So it can be a real challenge, both from a compliance standpoint, which Ronie spoke to, and then even from a litigation risk mitigation standpoint as well.
Wayne, if I could just add to that and actually make a plug. In our industry, I don't think we have historically been necessarily very active lobbying and educating our legislators across the country. But I'd like to make a plug for everybody that's listening to get involved. There are trade organizations. I happen to be involved with the Independent Beauty Association, IBA. There's also the Personal Care Products Council, PCPC, which are actively engaged with dealing and lobbying and meeting with legislators. And the reason that's critically important is because by and large, most of these legislators don't understand our industry the same way we do, obviously. They also don't have necessarily the depth of knowledge with regard to some of these chemicals, how they're used, the safety of the ingredients that we're using, and the like. And so I think it's critically important that the industry and companies, large and small, be engaged with these trade organizations so that we can go in, educate legislators, talk to them about coordinating across state lines so that we don't have the patchwork that Rachel just mentioned. So I really encourage companies to get more involved in terms of monitoring and then implementing comments that can go out to the industry and to the legislators in order to be able to influence the debate.
Yeah, the same problem affects other companies and other industries that are regulated by FDA. There are state laws in the food area in terms of food ingredients, labeling. Same also applies increasingly in the pharmaceutical and devices area. Has there been any discussion among the various industries to move forward on a coordinated basis to deal with this problem associated with patchwork legislation and federal preemption? Let me start with you, Ronie, then, please.
Yeah, absolutely. We are seeing cross industry coordination, particularly with regard to packaging laws and environmental laws that are coming up across the states. When you just mentioned the FDA and the other regulated businesses, food packaging is a big deal in terms of the recyclability and what is going on there. So, yeah, we do see cross industry coordination, in particular in these environmental and packaging laws that are coming through.
Rachel, anything to add?
No, I think Ronie captured it perfectly.
Last question before the break. PFAS and other chemicals of concern have become a flashpoint. And as you know, Makary requires FDA to report on PFAS in cosmetics by the end of this year. States like California and Oregon are already banning or restricting certain ingredients. We've seen the EU and France moving toward broad bans in cosmetics. How should companies navigate this environment? Again, I want to start with Ronie and then turn to Rachel on this one.
This is actually, to me, a very frustrating area, the PFAS, because there are thousands of PFAS chemicals out there. And the states have essentially, including California, many others, put a complete ban on any intentionally added PFAS to cosmetic and other products. And the reason I say this is frustrating is because there are good PFAS. And as a result of banning all, you've thrown out the baby with the bathwater. We actually tried after the PFAS ban was passed in California, but before it went into effect, lobbied the state of California to try to educate them about the good PFAS that are in the market, some of which have been approved by FDA and are in drugs that are being sold and prescribed to consumers. So as a result of that, we think this is another plug for educating the legislatures across the country that they should be more studious and more discretionary in terms of the chemical bans that they're putting in place. But PFAS is a very big issue. We've also seen not only the FDA and regulatory environment, but we are seeing a lot of activity on the consumer class action front. And the reason for this in part is not only because of the legislature and the laws that have been passed, but there's been a trend in our industry now for many, many years to focus on clean beauty or natural beauty. And what the consumer bar has done is it's gone out, and particularly there's a company out there called Balashore, which has gone out and tested a bunch of products, sunscreens, acne products, and the like. And through the testing methodologies that they have used, have determined that there are these forever chemicals or PFAS in some of these products that are being marketed as clean. And so the exposure there is very serious because when the government comes around and tells you to stop doing something, by and large, companies are good corporate citizens and they abide by what the FDA is saying. And the FDA will go away, by and large. That's not the case with consumer lawyers. They are after money primarily in order to be able to change the activities the companies are engaged in, whether or not those changes are warranted. And so PFAS has been a serious issue. Again, we need to educate the legislators before they pass new laws in order to be able to influence the discussion about what is safe to be in our products.
Rachel, you get the last word before our break.
Sure, of course. Yeah, no, I would certainly agree. I mean, PFAS has been a real source of confusion and frankly of consternation for sure among companies in the industry. And it's terribly challenging, for the reason Ronie mentioned, because it comes in all shapes and sizes. It's also really challenging to figure out for companies, what to test for and how to test. As I like to say, you can test until you're blue in the face and bankrupt. And it's hard for companies to balance that need and the fear mongering really that's going on in connection with PFAS and how to ensure that their products kind of withstand scrutiny. What makes it all the more challenging as well is just how ubiquitous PFAS is in our environment. It's in the water we drink and the air we breathe, and so that also makes it very very challenging and concerning when you're getting this patchwork of requirements from different states, and there's a lot of uncertainty as to how to properly test and can you give yourself some certainty from a liability standpoint.
Okay, with that, we're going to take a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. And we're back. We're talking cosmetics with Rachel Raphael from Morgan Lewis and Ronie Schmelz from K&L Gates. Rachel, start with you in the second half. Talk about labeling and advertising and promotion. What are you advising your clients in this area, in this environment?
Sure. And I'd like to start, I think Ronie alluded to this earlier, to start by talking about claims regarding wellness and sustainability benefits. I think those are really hot topics in litigation and big concerns among clients when it comes to marketing, advertising, and labeling. I think in particular, the unqualified clean and green claims continue to really face scrutiny in the marketplace and are increasingly the target of consumer-driven litigation, and namely class actions. And a primary driver for these types of suits is this idea that consumers are entitled to know exactly what's in their beauty products, and that means not just ingredients themselves, of course, but potential contaminants. And there's this sentiment among consumers that because companies are in the best position to protect them, they're obligated to do everything possible to do so. Note, I didn't say everything commercially reasonable to do so. And so I think what we're advising companies and what we're making sure they understand is when it comes to marketing and advertising and labeling, and particularly for companies who want to make claims about the wellness benefits of their products, the sustainability of their products or their practices, is that context really, really matters. So you need to explain what you mean when you use terms like clean or natural or non-toxic or organic. Use the company website, use the product packaging to educate consumers, to build trust, and to minimize the potential for misunderstanding, which often, you know, sets you up would otherwise set you up as a target in litigation, particularly consumer-driven litigation.
Ronie, anything to add to that?
Yeah, one of the main areas that we spend a lot of time working with clients on is claim substantiation, which is to say that, just taking the example that Rachel gave about clean beauty or even natural beauty, there are no regulatory definitions for those phrases, yet many companies use them. And I think Sephora gave the best example, which a court agreed with, which was, since clean isn't defined, Sephora did a really good job of telling consumers what that company means by the term. They were challenged in court because the plaintiff's bar wants to impose their own definition of clean, and the court thankfully rejected that, concluding that Sephora actually did do a very good job of educating their customers about what they mean by clean. But when I say substantiation, it's more than that. If you're going to make any kind of claim about your product, you have to be able to substantiate it. So if it's a claim about that the product works in a particular fashion or it delivers certain types of results, you need to have substantiation for that. And the best substantiation is not going to be just relying on marketing materials that your ingredient supplier might have provided. The best way to substantiate your claims about a particular product is to test the product. And you can do this either through a clinical setting, or you can do it through the consumer perception, or you can rely on studies. But in any event, you have to make sure that whatever claim you're making can be tied directly to support and substantiation for that claim. And that's really where we see the biggest challenges coming from the consumer class action bar. Essentially, what they do is they say, you advertised your product as delivering X result. My sole consumer used the product and didn't experience that result. Therefore, I'm suing you for false advertising because the product doesn't deliver in the way that you advertised it. And the way to push back on that is to have this substantiation that we've been talking about. So we view that as being critically important. And if you're going to use logos in order to kind of substantiate your claims or to be able to support that it meets a certain standard, whether it's vegan or the bunny, or green, whatever the case may be, again, you want to make sure that you are using those logos properly, you are meeting the standards that are out there, and that you are communicating truthfully about what is in your products.
Let me move on to one other question. We're at the end of 2025, 2026 is rapidly approaching. If one of your clients, let me start out with Rachel and then move to Ronie. If one of your clients came to you and said, what should I be thinking about for 2026 in terms of regulation, in terms of what's going on in the States? What should be on my agenda? What's your answer? How do you advise clients in this environment in terms of planning for the future?
Sure. I think, the three big compliance priorities I would put out there going into the next year, which hopefully you're already, all these companies are already doing well, First, I'd echo Ronie and say substantiation is essential. Companies need to make sure first that they have a real understanding of the claims that they're making, and the claims that others, namely social media influencers, which are used by a lot of companies in the industry, are making about their products. That means express and implied claims, and then confirming that you have the scientific backup for all of these claims, particularly for those that I mentioned that are focused on things like wellness and sustainability, given the litigation we're seeing in that area. Um, Another priority I would mention is taking a really hard look at your contracting partners. Companies need to scrutinize their supply chain and insist on transparency, and set clear expectations for all the third parties that they work with. Companies really are just as vulnerable as the weakest link, and so it's important that everyone in the supply chain has good record keeping hygiene. Number one, it's good is for your, if you're using a contract manufacturer, that they're adhering to good manufacturing practices, et cetera. And then I think as a third thing I'd mention is the need, I believe I mentioned this earlier too, the need to really monitor products once they hit the market and have systems in place that can collect, track, and investigate customer complaints where needed. Being able to adjust quickly is really critical from a compliance standpoint. It's also critical, frankly, from a brand reputation standpoint and a litigation mitigation or avoidance standpoint. And again, particularly true given the real-time adverse event reporting database I mentioned at the outset of the discussion.
Ronie, let me ask you the same question. Anything to add to what Rachel said?
Yeah, well, let me amplify a little bit the contracts that mentioned that Rachel just discussed. When I started working in this industry, I won't say how many years ago, most companies didn't have contracts. Most companies felt that a purchase order was enough to establish what the roles and responsibilities were of the parties. And as a litigator, I'm here to tell our audience that actually the purchase order isn't going to get you as far as you want, and that everybody should be contracting with all of their vendors. And it's not in order to be able to do a gotcha at the end of the day. It's really so that all the parties are fully on the same page in terms of who is doing what responsibilities they have, and the like. As one example, Mokra has a listing requirement for all of the products. It doesn't mean that you, the brand, necessarily have to list them. You can ask your contract manufacturer to do that. But the important point is to make sure that it is done. And that can be something that is addressed in the contract, as well as what kind of testing is going to be done, who is going to do the testing. But the other thing that I would really focus on, and this is a little bit outside of the realm of FDA watch, is that companies that are in this industry need to understand that the FDA is not the only agency you need to be concerned with. There are other regulatory agencies, one of which is critically important, which I mentioned earlier, the Federal Trade Commission, which oversees advertising to make sure that it is truthful and honest. The FTC is an important regulatory body you need to be thinking about. We've already talked about the states and the like in terms of the chemical bans. But not only are we not just talking about the products themselves, but there are ancillary things that every company is doing that are regulated. So, for example, all the companies that are selling direct to consumer, you are actually gathering consumer information. And there are restrictions and privacy laws out there with regard to what it is you can do with that information. There are lawsuits that we are seeing, and I'm sure many of the listeners themselves have gotten these lawsuits against their websites as not being compliant with the Americans with Disability Act, the ADA. We're seeing lawsuits that are challenging what consumers' information is being done with regard to websites. So what they call track and trace. In other words, you're tracking the information and you're tracing it, and maybe it's going out to a third party, but you didn't notify the consumer that your information was going to be used that way. We're seeing lawsuits about that. We've seen recently some lawsuits about influencers misrepresenting their relationship to the company or what their experience is with the products. It's not only important to have contracts with your influencers, but also to monitor them to make sure that they are operating within the bounds of proper communication to the consumer. I think Rachel mentioned there's greenwashing statutes that have come out in terms of what you can say about recyclability and the impact that your product has, not only on individuals, but on the environment as well. So the real takeaway is that the FDA is critically important because we are operating in an industry that is regulated under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. But we cannot put blinders on. There are many other agencies, as well as many other areas and topics that you need to be mindful of as you operate your business, because there are pitfalls in not knowing what is out there that impacts the way that you conduct your business.
That was a great summation by both of you as to what companies need to be thinking about. I want to thank you both for being great guests. We're going to turn briefly to our resource link segment, where we provide you with some valuable links that you might want to check out. These links are included on our website, fdawatch.net. Let's first go to the Pharma research. In mid-November, CDER Director Prasad and Commissioner Makary published in the New England Journal of Medicine a very important concept, FDA's new plausible mechanism pathway that will enable the development and approval of highly personalized therapies, particularly bespoke gene and cell therapies for very rare conditions. This is designed for situations where randomized clinical trials are simply not feasible. Developers would need to demonstrate a clear biological rationale, the target engagement, meaningful clinical benefit in consecutive patients before receiving marketing approval. Post-approval, they would have to gather real-world evidence. This is an important concept that Commissioner Makary and Dr. Prasad have been advancing. Our resource link takes you to their paper. Let's turn to our device resource link. The Bipartisan Policy Center has a fact sheet that breaks down how AI is being used in medical devices. This is a downloadable fact sheet. You can get the link on our resource link. It's titled AI 101, AI-Enabled Medical Devices, and it offers a categorization of the leading applications of AI in devices. Easily digestible. It's a good educational resource. Check it out through our resource link, again, fdawatch.net. In the foods area, FDA and CDC, along with the California Department of Public Health, Infant Botulism Treatment and Prevention Program, and other state and local partners, continue to investigate a multi-state outbreak of infant botulism. This outbreak was first reported in early November. It stems from ByHeart's Whole Nutrition Infant Formula, which is a product that has since been recalled. As of just a few days ago, the outbreak has affected a total of 23 infants from 13 states. One of the things that people are talking about in this regard is that the way that ByHeart initially reacted was that they appeared to minimize the risk associated with this, and then secondarily they came out with the recall. And the number of people have told me this is a great example of how not to handle a crisis. Our resource link takes you to FDA's landing page, which is being periodically updated as this develops. Finally, in the cosmetics area, the Personal Care Products Council has launched its Buy, that's B-U-Y, Buy No Lie campaign ahead of the holiday shopping season to alert consumers about the risks of counterfeit cosmetics and personal care products. And the campaign emphasizes that fake products can pose health hazards, such as exposure to harmful substances, and undermine consumer confidence in the industry. It urges shoppers to check before checkout and buy from trusted sources. Again, all of these resources are available at fdawatch.net. On that note, I want to thank Rachel and Ronie again for being such excellent guests in this episode. Both of you really provided, I think, wonderful information for clients, for consumers, and for others who are concerned about the cosmetics area. I'd also like to thank our podcast creator and executive producer, Michael Levin Epstein, our assistant producer, Sam Hoffmeister. I want to remind you, if you want to be a marketing partner or a sponsor or just comment, you can contact us at info at fdawatch.net, info at fdawatch.net. And don't forget our website, fdawatch.net. If you haven't subscribed, I urge you to do so. Finally, if you're so inclined to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast, it really does make a difference. And so, as we say at the end of every episode of FDA Watch, if you really want to watch what FDA is doing, listen to FDA Watch.